future pilots. My name is Anna Serpinenko, and today I'm recording the video as an authorized person. So it's all related to obtaining your licenses. So who is an authorized person? So it's a person that is acting on behalf of Transport Canada on issuing the licenses, so people from the industry. And our job is to verify that the candidate has the required credentials, and basically we accepting the documents, verifying that everything is in order, all requirements are fulfilled. And if we are satisfied with it, then we can issue a temporary license or rating and submit all the documents to Transport Canada. And then sometime later in the mail, you will receive your original. So it's important to note that you actually do not have to go through an authorized person to obtain your license. You can submit your application directly to Transport Canada. So you can save yourselves a little bit of fees, but be prepared to have somewhat of a delay as well. If an authorized person is able to process your license sometimes within a day, if everything is correct, all requirements are fulfilled, all the documents are in place, so you can get your license pretty much the same day. Or if there's something to correct, you find out about it right away, and you will be able to do the necessary. If you're going through Transport Canada, you will have a delay both in processing and in the feedback. So if something needs to be corrected, it can take a little bit of time of back and forth until you get your license in hand. Also, if you have any of the foreign credits, for example, you flew overseas and you're using that prior experience, then your only way to obtain a Canadian license is to go through Transport Canada, and AP cannot process your license in this case. Also, APs are typically delegated by type. So I can do recreational pilot permits, private pilot, commercial pilot licenses, night ratings, VFR-OTT, I think. I have never done one, not a very common one. But for example, I wouldn't be able to do an IFR. Other people who are delegated for that type would be able to do those. So you need to inquire what AP type is the person before you obviously submit your documents to them. Now, in this video, we will talk about the application for PPL and CPL. They're pretty similar. And I'll just go over the documents and put a few comments on about how to make your application successful. Most of this information you will already know from your PPL, CPL ground school, and it's just a matter of putting the package in an efficient way. So to do this, I developed a checklist, two-page checklist here, and I will link to this video the checklist and the documents I'm talking about so that you can easily find that information. Now, again, about the APs and availabilities, typically flight schools would have their own often enough. For whatever reason, that person might not be available or might not be one in the school. So it's totally fine to go anywhere to find an authorized person for the license you need. For example, I was once away on an extended trip. We had an agreement with another flight school where our students' licenses were signed off and vice versa. I often have inquiries from some smaller schools or freelance instructors as well. They are not our students in the flight school, but they are coming for AP services. So AP is not tied to a specific flight school in the sense where we can provide service to someone who is not even a flight school customer. So, and same goes for this checklist. I made it publicly available, and even if you are applying somewhere else for your license or direct to GC, feel free to use it. Hopefully it will make it streamlined for everybody. So let's start. First section are the documents to submit. So we have the application form. Has to be PPL, CPL, whichever one. And I'm going quickly through these documents because we will talk about each and every single one of them in more details. But just to assemble the package: application form, pilot training record, personal logbook, student pilot permit if you're applying for PPL, or provide your PPL if you're applying for CPL, your medical, if you have a booklet, it might be in your booklet, proof of your written exam completion, proof of your flight test completion. For PPL, you need the proof of the language completion. You need to pay the Transport Canada fees online and provide the receipt. You would typically provide the payment for EP services. And if you don't have a booklet, you will also attach a booklet application. Also, if you want to have a different name on your license than the name in your passport, then you can fill in a name declaration as an additional document. It's a form that you can ask from an AP, and your request would be accommodated. So let's look at the application form. So you need to fill in the parts A and B. A is your personal information, address, phone number. Be aware that this will be the address, not necessarily your main address on file, but the address where your license will be mailed, where your booklet will be mailed. So you may have your permanent address, but then for the next few months, you're staying in a different location. Or often enough, we have international students who may be renting a room here, but can move next month or so. They often even use the school's address to receive their important documents. Part B have to be signed with your original signature. I'm not sure, I do not think electronic signatures are accepted. I never had the application signed electronically, and I would be inclined to say that I don't think you can sign electronically, so you actually need your live signature on the piece of paper. The rest of the form can be filled in electronically and printed out. Make sure your address, phone number are correct license type. So if it's PPL or CPL applications, there are two separate forms. Times that you have in the part B of the application have to meet all the legal requirements, all the requirements as per CARS. So if you need 5 hours of instruments, it has to be there. If maximum out of it can be in the 3 hours in the simulator, that's what you have. You can have more, you cannot have less. And at the end of this checklist, there is a reminder, all the PPL and CPL requirements as per CARS. If you forgot them, check them up either in this checklist or in the Canadian air regulations. Be aware that flight tests are typically dual, but you cannot log cross-country, dual cross-country, or dual instruments on your flight test, because it's a test, it's not training. And your requirement is for a specific amount of training, so you cannot log instrument on your flight test. Next, and the last part of the last two parts of the application form, you just leave blank. That's for an AP and for Transport Canada to fill them in, so you don't need to put anything there. PTR. Now, this is the biggest check item on your application, because that's basically the proof of your entire training, and there's lots of things to check there. For PPL, there has to be a pre-solo page. It's not the page with all your pre-solo flights, but it is the page of all the pre-solo requirements. In particular, all the exercises that have to be signed off before your first solo, signed off by your instructor, recommendation of your instructor for you to go first solo. And you will also have a bunch of information like P-star date, radio license, medical, maybe type exam, and often enough on the same page, there is also a flight test recommendation. The real critical part in this entire page are those pre-solo exercises signed off and the recommendation for the first solo. Everything else is kind of a gravy, helps us to organize everything, but those items are critical. We have to double check that your first that your SPP, student pilot permit, was issued before your first solo, so that you were legal on your first solo. If your SPP was reissued for whatever reason, maybe it expired 5 years later and you still didn't have your license, then attach both old and new one as well. Ground school, you either have a section in your PTR saying that you attended ground school and you need to have it signed off. All the topics have to be word for word. exactly like they are required in the cars, or you would have a ground school letter from wherever you have followed wherever you completed your ground school, and it would be a letter issued, typically signed by the chief flight instructor, about the ground school completed. The requirement is 40 hours for PPL and 80 hours up to PPL for CPL. So you cannot count 40 hours of PPL towards CPL as well. Then we are moving on in your PTR to all the flights. So all the pages have to be totaled and signed. Often enough these days, PTRs are electronic, so it's kind of totaled automatically. Still make sure it is signed. If you have some messy cross flights when it's filled in by hand, just in case, it doesn't hurt to attach a copy of the journey log. That those flights can be verified if they're hard to read or quite messy in the PTR, but better just not have messy flights in the PTR and those crossing off. Next, we're checking the long cross country for PPL. That will be 150 nautical mile cross country. For the full stops that you need to do, it has to be a separate line. So if usually on your cross country, for example, you can log going from Pitt Meadows to Chilliwack and back, so basically from Pitt Meadows to Pitt Meadows via Chilliwack, you can do that for the regular cross countries. For the cross countries where you have a full stop, the 150 for PPL and 300 for CPL, each leg to each full stop has to be a separate line. That's important. And make sure that it fulfills the legal requirement, the distance, and the number of stops. You can overfly some points. They also count as a distance for PPL, as long as the total distance is a minimum of 150, and it's usually an approved route for the specific flight school that you have been flying with. So it's not just any 152. For CPL, it can be any destination, 300 nautical mile radius. So it doesn't matter if you were flying like this to build the 300 miles. From your original point to your furthest point, it has to be 300 miles on a straight line. So that's what it means, 300 miles radius, not 300-mile distance. Now, on the way, you have to make your stops, so 3 stops. 3 full stops. You can do more stops if you need to. You can, if at 300 miles you don't have an airport, so you can do all your 3 stops on the way and then overfly some prominent point, put coordinates, can be some mountain, for example, or a lake, or somehow determine where that furthest point is, but you don't have to actually land at your furthest point as long as you navigated to there and came back and did all your stops as required. Then we are checking all the other cross countries. Every cross country must have a route. Pitt Meadows to Pitt Meadows is not a cross country. You might have been doing circuits. If you did Pitt Meadows via Chilliwack, then it is a cross country. So always make sure there is a route for your cross country. Next thing we are checking, a little bit tricky. You need to make sure that every single exercise, every single required exercise has been taught. So for PPL, it's pretty much all of them, starting from familiarization all the way to the emergencies. Those are the columns in your EPTR. What you can skip is nav aids and partial panel. Those 2 are not required for your PPL. They're only required for CPL. And vice versa for CPL, familiarization or ancillary controls are not required. Presumably, you already have your license and you already know all of those, but the partial panel and the nav aids will be needed for CPL. So all the needed exercises must have typically at least a D, a dual training, possibly an S, but at some point they need to be taught. You will have done those elements. So the way I would typically teach, I would take each exercise and just start looking until I see that it has been taught somewhere and I need to check them all this way. The final totals on your EPTR, EPTR or PTR have to match the numbers on your application that fulfill the legal requirements. It's pretty straightforward for PPL because they are probably matching your logbook, matching your application, and your entire training. It's all the line you have done. For CPL, on the application, there are kind of two parts. There is one part where it says total experience, and you have your total flight time, and you have your total cross-country time. That has to be certain numbers. And then you have training. And training part for CPL is the training part that you have done after your PPL. So it's not all your flying, this is only a CPL training part done after PPL, and that's what in your EPTR or PTR, and this is what is on your application form. So in your PTR, in the very beginning, brought forward should be 0, even though you did have prior flight experience because you already have a PPL before you start CPL training. You will have only the CPL training portion in your PTR. It's important. So you have brought forward in your CPL, and this is the portion that you will show in your application form. So the numbers at the end of your PTR will have to match the numbers on your application form for the training part. And for your total experience, total flight time, these numbers will need to match your logbook. Again, for PPL, all of that typically matches. For CPL, those are the two elements. We can have more in our logbooks. If, for example, you went flying with friends, you put it in your logbook, that's fine. It might not be in your PTR, that's okay, as long as PTR fulfills your requirements. And all the flights in the PTR are also in your logbook, but the logbook can have some additional flights. That's acceptable. Next, we are checking the instrument time. So there are a few rules about that. So obviously you cannot have instrument taxiing. So, and we expect the difference of about at least 0.2 between air time and flight time. And instrument time cannot be higher than the air time because you can only be on instruments. Now, you probably don't take off or land on instruments. So most often than not, your instrument time is even less than your air time, but that's assumed that you just got airborne, the instructor gave you the hood, you put the hood on and you're flying until the instructor brings you back on short final. At the most, your instrument time can be your air time, but definitely not more than that. So meaning it would be at least 0.2 less than your flight time. Also, it can be only dual flight. You cannot do any solo instruments, even if you have like a safety pilot. And I know in other countries, it might be acceptable to have either safety pilot or also have a PIC under supervision, the PICOS time. Transport Canada is quite hesitant accepting those. So chances are you would need to do the proper Canadian requirements. Again, for anything foreign, consult Transport Canada directly. In Canada, you can only do instrument time as PPL, CPL student when you're dual, when you're with an instructor. You cannot go with another student and have them spot for you while you are doing instruments. If you are IFR rated, which is possible, for example, somebody who has a PPL, got their instrument rating and later doing CPL, you still cannot count instrument time as a PIC. It also only has to be dual. So theoretically, you could be IFR rated and actually flying IFR, maybe in a cloud, your own plane or whichever rental plane. You could be legal to do so, but you still cannot count as your CPL training. It has to be dual flying. Again, no instrument time on the flight test. For PPL, you cannot have any night time. The earliest time you can have night is after your PPL when you're applying for your instructor, for your, night rating, or later with a part of CPL. Now, if you're doing CPL, your night rating will be included. If you're doing a full CPL, there is an option of restricted CPL if you're doing your CPL up north, where there is 6 months of daylight, so you cannot do night rating. There is an option to obtain day VFR only, CPL. It might be an option, but if you have an unrestricted CPL, you will have all the night requirements. You get the night rating before. Now, some people sometimes prefer apply for the night rating so that they can carry passengers while flying at night before they obtain CPL. For example, during commercial time building, 2 students could fly together if they are night rated and they basically carry each other as a passenger and take turns flying. If you don't do it, if you don't do a separate night rating application, you can still fly at night solo or dual with an instructor, but you cannot carry passengers, and passengers include other students. You cannot double count night and instrument. So you can have an hour flight, half an hour by night, half an hour logged as instrument, so logged as day and instrument, but you cannot have an hour flight and out of them half an hour instrument and the entire hour night. So the same, you can have some elements of instrument, some elements of nighttime on the same flight, but the same chunk of time cannot be logged under both. You can log night and cross country, and in fact, you are required to do some night cross country for your night rating. And you cannot log cross country and instruments. So that's for both PPL and CPL. You can, again, do part of your flight as instrument, part of your flight as cross country, but you cannot log cross country on instruments. This is a little bit tricky for CPL, because some of you might have done also IFR, and IFR rating does require IFR cross country. So often enough, you would have it logged in your logbook as instrument and cross country, which is a requirement for IFR, but you can only log it one way or the other for the CPL. And because you were flying it on instruments, typically it's being logged as instrument time, not as cross country time. If you did on your flight some circuits or some air work, for example, you went to Chilliwack and back, and the whole flight was 2 hours, but you stopped for half an hour in the practice area to do your steep turns, your cross-country portion will be only an hour and a half, and half an hour is your general practice, but steep turns are not cross-country. Also, if you're getting your license processed in your flight school, it typically doesn't come as a question. This last item on the PTR is to obtain all the training from a valid instructor rating holder. So I know all my instructors, I know that they have their valid instructor rating, so I can just have a glance, make sure there's nobody I don't know on the list, and I would sign off. Now, if somebody would bring an application to me and there's John Doe as an instructor, I don't know who John Doe is. I don't know if he holds an instructor rating. And as an AP, we do not have access to the entire Transport Canada database easily so that we can verify this information. We can make a special request if we really have to. We can probably obtain this information, but it will probably take quite a bit of time. So the easiest is if you have your instructor give you a copy of the instructor rating to prove that indeed at the time when they were flying with you, they had a valid instructor rating. Or it can be a letter from your school to the AP confirming that indeed those instructors were valid instructors at the time of the instruction. What can potentially happen, I mean, typically nobody would just go out and start instructing without holding an instructor rating. It would be very untypical and very easy to catch. What can happen, for example, someone's instructor rating is expiring October 1st. They keep flying for the last year or the last 2 years, depending on when it expires, and they just forgot. And if there is no system that alerts them about it, Transport Canada is not going to be chasing anyone. Oh yeah, your rating is expiring. Same for the medical. But it's up to you as a PIC, and instructor's responsibility as an instructor PIC to make sure their ratings are valid. But it is possible, say, for example, then they go, they renew it 2 weeks later. But if they were instructing in those 2 weeks, all those flights would not be valid training. And this is an important distinction, important thing to check, that for you to have those hours valid, your instructor has to have a valid instructor rating during the time of your training. So these are most of the things to check on the PTR. Obviously, it has to be signed both by the instructor and the student, totaled, and have comments. Now, CARS doesn't specifically say the amount of comments and the content of comments, but it has to be something reasonable. If you're repeating circuit 10 times, circuit flight 10 times, and every circuit is saying good, 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 why are you not going solo, for example? So the comments have to be reflective of what actually is happening in trainings. They need more work on flare. That's totally fine. There should be some comments. And so the next item is we have completed everything we need to check in the PTR. Next, we will move on to the logbook. All flights have been entered, totaled, and signed. Most of the logbooks are pretty good with it. There is a line for the signature. In some logbooks, and I'm working right now with a few applications from Air Cadets, they do not have a line for the signature. It still needs to be somehow certified by the pilot. It's basically self-certification saying that all these hours I confirm they are correct. So if you don't have a line for that signature, just sign in the corner of each page. That's your confirmation that the hours you put there are correct. That's you confirming that. Your school can stamp and certify your hours. We typically do that automatically at the license application time. It is not a requirement, not a legal requirement to have the logbook stamped unless there's some doubts that certain flights happened. Also, you are perfectly legal to have an electronic logbook as long as you have all the columns required appearing there. It can be an Excel spreadsheet or some specialized app. And what you do at the time of your license application, you would basically just print out your logbook from Excel or whichever application you're using, and you will just sign that printed out version. So you don't have to have a paper logbook permanently, but you do need to print it out and sign at the time of your license application. Move away from the sun a little bit here. All right, here we go. Now, all the flights that you have in your PTR will also need to be in your logbook, but your logbook can have more flights than your PTR has, and we have already discussed that, especially for the CPL. All totals must match the numbers you have on the license application. That's mandatory. And I will be checking that you are not asking for any foreign credits in your application. If you do, I will basically just say, okay, I can still check certain things to make sure that it looks okay, but I will not be able to sign off your license. You will basically need to contact Transport Canada to have it processed. Now, it doesn't mean you cannot fly overseas. For example, when I was applying for my license, in between I went flying with friends in Switzerland. I did have that flight in my logbook. It was just part of those flights that are in addition in your logbook. They're not part of your PTR. So I was not counting that flight for my license application. I still had a couple of hours of flying overseas, but I was not requesting any foreign credits or any foreign flight time. So it's perfectly fine to go flying overseas. It's not like it will complicate your license, but if you want to count those times, it will be a little bit longer processing. Next couple of things we have to check. So we're almost done. That will be the written exam. Something to watch for. It's only valid for 2 years from the time of your first exam. So if you had to do a portion of it, partial, you would need to make sure that all the exams are within 24 months, not just the last one. And it's 24 months from your application date, ideally from when it's processed. Now, for example, if you're submitted into Transport Canada 1 week before your written exam expires, but it has been accepted and then processed later, you will not lose it. But there is a risk that, for example, you have 0.1 of instrument missing. And now you have submitted, now the time has passed, now it is discovered that you don't have the requirements, you go back to the requirements, but by the time you complete the requirements, your written exam expired. So important thing is do everything and apply right away, don't drag it out. Written exam is valid for 2 years. It is huge, plenty of time to do everything. Flight test is valid for 1 year, same thing, plenty of time to complete your application. Obviously, they have to be close enough to each other. Don't let it expire. There's absolutely no reason for that. There's plenty of time for each. For the flight test, same thing. Everything has to be within the last 12 months, not just the latest test, if it was a partial, for example. Really, the deadlines are really important. Medical certificate has to be valid and of the appropriate category, Cat 3 for PPL, Cat 1 for CPL. You can have Cat 1 for PPL, that's fine, but you can't have Cat 3 for CPL, so make sure it's valid and as required by your age. Language, so it's kind of applicable, but not to everybody. So you can have a formal language assessment, and it would be done by a language examiner, usually over the phone, and you will receive a formal report. You will need to submit it with your license. For Canadian citizens only, and if you completed or are in the process of completing Canadian English speaking high school, then you can get away with only an informal language assessment. What it means, basically, your flight examiner at the day of your flight test will say, okay, that person can speak English and formal assessment completed. You will have a note of that on your flight test report. Now, if you have this note on your flight test report, it's not a guarantee yet that you actually don't need a formal one, because the examiner is typically not verifying all the conditions. All they're saying informally, I can say that person's language is adequate. But you need to provide a proof that indeed you're eligible for that basically exemption from the formal assessment. And for that, you need to provide the proof that you are a Canadian citizen, passport is sufficient, or birth certificate, or citizenship certificate. You don't have to be born Canadian, you have to be Canadian citizen at the time of the application. And you also need to have completed a Canadian English-speaking high school. So if you're a Canadian citizen, even born here, but you completed, for example, Hindi or Mandarin-speaking high school, you would not be eligible. So you would need to do a formal assessment. If I had a case, a Canadian citizen having completed a UK British, obviously English-speaking high school, still needed to do a formal assessment. So the only exemption is Canadian citizen and having completed a high school. If you have not finished the high school and you are in the process of completing it, then instead of high school diploma, you can bring a grades transcript, something that shows that you are a student in a high school in Canada in English. So if you fulfill those requirements and you have that note on your flight test, then you can skip the language exam. If not, you do the language exam, you need to submit the report. It's a pretty easy exam, but again, don't drag anything out to the last minute. You don't want to find out the last minute when all your other exams are expiring that you need that exam, and then you cannot find an exam on the same day. So things can take time if there are things to correct. The more complete and accurate your application, the easier it will be. Last thing is the application for the booklet. If you don't have one, you will need a passport picture also, so fill in the form. Really important is the signature should not touch the borders, otherwise the form will be invalid. You will need your passport picture, and the passport picture has to be recent, so it needs to be stamped with the date. And then you will need somebody to certify. So if I am the one processing your license, for example, most of the time, I don't know the person for at least 2 years. So I will need to identify the person. So I will need a picture ID. If you have your passport, that's perfect. We will use that. I will certify that this is truly you. And I will sign your form and your picture with the copy of your passport. Now, it doesn't have to be me, it doesn't have to be an AP, it can be any Canadian citizen doing that for you, except for close people. You have all the rules on the back of the application. So it doesn't have to be me, but it does need to be somebody certifying you. For certification, it needs to be a picture ID, government issued picture ID. So you cannot use a birth certificate or citizenship certificate. At least the older versions didn't have the picture. Newer versions, some do. Not for the birth certificate, for the citizenship certificate. So kind of a picture ID, but you can also have, for example, driver's license. Because unlike for the proof of citizenship, like we needed for the language, or that we needed for the student pilot permit earlier, for the booklet application, it's not the proof of citizenship. This is a proof of your identity. So picture ID will do. On the other hand, for example, driver's license will not work as a proof of citizenship in the past. So different applications may require different supporting documents. And whoever is the person certifying you on the form should be the same person signing also the back of the passport picture that you are attaching. And then if that person hasn't known you for at least 2 years, then they will use a document, a picture ID to identify you. Otherwise, the identification can be done without a supporting document if they have known you for 2 years or longer. All the application parts will be scanned and emailed these days to Transport Canada, except for the booklet application, because we have a physical passport picture, and then we will mail it to Transport Canada. Any special cases that may arise, we can clarify, ask. Sometimes there are a certain number of restrictions or some unusual situations, some prior credits and so on. It's something on a case-by-case basis. So if you foresee some questions, you can always contact Transport Canada for clarification, or contact the nearest authorized person that would be able to help you with that. I hope this video was helpful. All the details are important. Follow it to the letter, follow the checklist to the letter, and I'll provide the links to the documents. Good luck with your applications and fly safe.